There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Love has never been a popular movement, and no one's ever wanted really to be free. The world is held together, really it is held together, by the love and the passion of very few people. Otherwise, of course, you can despair. Walk down the street of any city, any afternoon, and look around you. What you got to remember is what you're looking at is also you. Everyone you're looking at is also you. You could be that person. You could be that monster. You could be that cop. And you have to decide in yourself not to be.
Hello BookTube, I'm Sean Breeze Books. Welcome back to my channel. And another Friday Reads. This one is pretty somber. I'm not going to pontificate because, good lord, I don't know anything. Or very little. So I thought we'd start with the words of James Baldwin. That's from a documentary. I'll link up with the title of this documentary in the show notes. And the despair he talked about resonates so deeply with the kind of week I've had since Tuesday night's horrific election results from the United States of America. I was just doom scrolling on Twitter, something that I'm just going to have to wean myself off of, and I came across some etymological account that said we need to resurrect this word, and the word put forth in need of being resurrected is respair. Here it is. So it's the opposite of despair. Fresh hope. Recovery from despair. And I need to do that. I think we all do, whatever that looks like, whatever that means. I got way too absorbed in following every micro development and argument in this long election campaign. It was absolutely fascinating, and the results are infuriating and utterly demoralizing. But me paying such deep attention is not going to help with the social political respair project, very much required in America, but around the world. We're on the verge of electing a Trump-light asshole. I expect he'll cozy up to Trump and his policies will follow. That's about the be-all and end-all of my commentary on the election, but it has kind of wiped out this week. I canceled all of my buddy read check-ins for the week because I just knew I wasn't going to really be doing anything except following every micro-development of the election and its results. And the last thing, I'll just link in the show notes, a wonderful, is it 6 or 10 minute, maybe 12-minute video from Rachel Maddow, who I love and have been listening to since the early days of the Obama-Clinton primaries. And her respair-focused pep talk the day after the election. I'll put the link in the show notes, and you might find some respair from watching. My mystery guest is American, and we talk. Our chat was filmed the morning after the election, and so the first part of it is about the election. And if you don't, I encourage you to watch it, but if you don't want to watch it, just fast forward until you see that guest's book gif on the screen, because that's when we start talking about their book. Without further ado, here is this week's mystery guest. And this week's mystery guest is a stranger to very few of you, I'm sure. This is Brian of the fabulous BookTube channel, Bookish, joining us from Texas. And we are filming this on November 6th at 11 a.m. I think we're probably in similar shape here after the election results yesterday. But we are here to talk about Brian's new book. It's called MacArthur's Bloody Butchers, Company G, 163rd Infantry Regiment in the Pacific War, which came out just a few weeks ago. But before we get into that, Brian, how are you? How are you feeling?
I'm doing okay. I'm mad more than I was sad. I was sad for quite some time, and now I'm just mad. So Mad is usually more productive for me than sad. I have a tendency to wallow in my sadness and to be more active in my anger. So
Well, and you made that lovely video series on why not to vote for Trump, but I guess not enough people watched it.
clearly not enough. And I got so mad last night at like I was up at like 3:30 still, and I just deleted all the videos about Trump or anything. I couldn't stand to have them on my channel and know that they had, not that I expect them to change millions of minds or anything like that, but just to have them there felt like it was mocking me. So at 3:30, 4 o'clock this morning, I thought I'm just going to delete all that stuff. And I did. I might regret it later, but right now I didn't see any
Oh,
point
and
in having it there.
I'm sure that there will be, have more to say on the topic over the next few years. I am just at a loss. I just have no words. I'm just so demoralized. You're a white American, and I know where your loyalties lie, but oh my God, this was the white vote. Brought
Yep.
him back
You
stronger
know,
than
I
ever.
one of the things that's made me maddest today and has kind of got me fired up is looking at the returns by gender and race, that 52% of white women voted for Trump, and I think more than 69% of white men had voted for Trump. And so to me, when I look at that number and I look at the fact that Joe Biden actually won the vote for white men 4 years ago. To me, there's only one reason for that vote total being the way it is, and that's just racism. I can't, people can talk about any other reason they want to, bad campaign, bad candidate, bad whatever. When you look at those numbers, there is really only one thing, well, two things. There's really only two things that explain it, and one is racism, the other is misogyny. If you add those two things together, I think that's the only thing you can get to explain why only 39% of white men voted for Kamala Harris. That is ridiculously low. Everybody talked about how black men were kind of moving away from Kamala Harris, and that's fine. That's great. That's still 79% of black men still voted for her. But you can't say
Sure.
the same thing about white men and white women. And that's where the election was decided. That's where the election was won and lost. And I'm not saying every person who voted for Trump, man or woman, I'm not saying every white person who voted for Trump is a racist, but I'm saying racism is a big part of that result, whether it is open racism, acknowledged racism, a kind of racism that people don't realize is there. There's nothing else that is clearly defines what happened to me as that.
Yeah, it's just horrifying. I actually suspect that you authored this. I found it under an account named Machine Pun Kelly, but I think that might be your pseudonym. This is what it says. He was the worst president in history, and when he got voted out, he tried to stage a coup. Then he stole national secrets and sold the ones he didn't store in the bathroom. He was convicted of fraud, found liable of sexual assault, and convicted of 34 felonies. He is $500 million in debt, owned by God only knows who, and the biggest national security risk the nation has ever had. But at least he's not a black woman.
Right. That I didn't author that, but I that is clearly the sentiment, but that drove a lot of people either to vote or not to vote. The vote totals for Trump are about where they were 4 years ago. The vote totals for Harris are a good 15, 20 million votes short of what Biden got. And honestly, is Kamala Harris less charismatic, less well-spoken than Joe Biden? Of course she's not. So there has to be a simpler reason, and I just think that's race and misogyny. And I'm willing to fight anybody who wants to argue with me about it because I can't see anything else.
The next quote, which I'm putting up in place of words that I don't have, is from the Russian American novelist Gary Steingart. And this is just a very short tweet. They're eating the cats, they're eating the dogs. Proved a more effective message than, let me help you buy your first house.
Yep. I mean, again, what else can it be? The part of the other thing I've looked at is the breakdown of the vote by age group. And the only age group that Trump won is my generation, Generation X, which makes me even angrier that people my age who aren't facing the problems of affording a home or paying off college debt or childcare or any of the other problems that younger generations have, voted in the worst possible person, or what I'm just going to say, the worst possible person who's ever run for president of the United States is Andrew Jackson.
So, as a segue to getting into more book talks, and it's a premature question, but
Okay.
how do you think this result in the next 4 years that you will face, that we will all face, do you think, if at all, will it affect your reading life?
I suspect I'll read more nonfiction. That would be my suspicion. I'm reading some nonfiction which focuses on the history of racism in the United States right now, and I imagine that kind of reading will continue at least for a while, and then pick up during Black History Month. I'm going to celebrate it whether or not Trump ends it or not. I think nonfiction will probably call me more than fiction in the coming year at least. I hold out hope that the Democrats have a narrow chance of holding on to the House of Representatives or winning the House of Representatives. If that happens, there's at least one check on Trump's power. And it may not seem like much, but it's a whole lot more than no checks on Trump's power. So I don't think that's going to happen. I think the Republicans are going to hold the House, but there is still some hope that the Democrats might win a one-seat majority in the House of Representatives.
I guess the only other comment I have, and it's certainly not original to me, but the only charitable view of the white vote being majority for Trump is that some of those people just thought he doesn't mean what he says, rather than that they agree with what he says. That's as charitable as I can be to white
Right.
Trump voters. And
But
I guess I want to align myself with them, that I hope he didn't mean what he says, but he
I
did.
do too. My hope in that area is that number one, the budget for 2025 is already in place. That's Biden's budget because we have to start our budget in September or October of the year before. So the 2025 budget is Biden's. And that's a law, and that money has to be spent the way it was. That's kind of why Biden had to keep building the wall, because money was appropriated for that purpose. So there's that. So we really won't see the first Trump budget impact until 2026. That doesn't mean he can't raise tariffs as soon as he gets into office. He probably can, and I know for sure the courts and Congress isn't going to stop him from doing that, which I think will have a fairly rapid negative effect on the economy. And the other part of my hope is that if the Democrats don't win control of the House, there's the midterm election in 2026. And I know everybody's worried about the future of American democracy, and I can't tell you I'm not, but I have a hard time believing that there aren't 3 to 4 Republican senators and 7 to 10 Republican members of the House of Representatives who are going to want to keep those institutions viable, who are not going to go along with just everything that Trump wants to do. And therefore, I think we're going to definitely have midterm elections, and that gives me hope. Additionally, and this is the third thing, and now I've gone on way too long about this, but it's your fault. You asked me. Additionally, after the midterm elections in 2026, Trump becomes a lame duck. He can't help anybody get elected again. He can never, assuming we still are a functioning democracy following the Constitution, he can never be president again. His power will decline within his party fairly rapidly, I think, and that gives me hope as well as, perhaps picking up control of the Senate or the House in the midterms. But that's a lot of me hoping on things that are not for certain, and before yesterday, we could say those elections were certainly going to happen, but I don't think we can say that anymore.
Well, until Genji gets here, Brian, there's a spare space in the bed beside me if you want to get the hell out of that godforsaken country.
Can me, my son, and my wife fit in that space?
Sure, the more the
Right.
merrier.
And I have to bring the dog too, so Zelda has to come. No, I'm staying here. I have a granddaughter here, and I'm going to do what I can to make sure that this crap gets turned around, I hope.
Well, more power to you. You are also a recently published, it's not your first book, but you're a recently published author. So please give us an introduction to MacArthur's Bloody Butchers.
Okay, so that's the title of my book, and it was published by Casemate Publishers at the end of September of this year. So it's been out a little bit longer than a month. Basically, it's a military history of the company That's a military unit that my great uncle was in during World War II. So it's Company G of the 163rd Regiment of the 41st Division that fought in the war in the Pacific. And I know all of that automatically turns off people who are not interested in military history, because that's a lot of this group's part of that group. And there's a lot of that kind of stuff in the title. And there's that stuff in the book because it's a military history published by a military history publisher. But at the same time, what I hope is, and what I wanted to achieve was a story of four men from that company, their relationship with one another, the experiences they had, whether those were combat experiences or romantic experiences or friendship experiences or, hey, isn't Australia weird experiences, whatever those things were, that to me, that's the heart of the book. Those four men, one of whom was my uncle. And so each one of the men, when I found had research that told me they knew something about this or they had something to say about this event, their story is in there, not separated out, but blended together. So you kind of at various points in time get all their points of view on what was going on. So when they were in Australia training, you get three of the soldiers' experiences when they were in Australia. And, my uncle and one of the other men were really good friends, in part because they dated Australian girls who were friends with one another. And so it just kind of goes on from there. And then when I followed them and the rest of the company and the regiment division to all the places that they fought in the Pacific during World War II. Sorry if that was a really long answer.
That was an absolutely fascinating answer. And so you had an uncle, so you probably had personal private papers or letters or something of his, but I'd like to hear a bit more about that. And also, what kind of documents or documentation did you find about the other three?
Okay, so my uncle, I didn't know he fought in World War II until I was a grown-up. I'd known him all my life, spent time at his house. He never spoke about it. I didn't ask any questions, probably because by the time I knew anything, I was a teenager, and everybody knows teenagers aren't interested in what old people may have done. So I ignored it. And then by the time I was in my 20s, I was off living my life. I just didn't know. So he did an interview with another relative of ours, which was on VHS, and my dad let me watch it. He loaned me the tape and let me watch it. And as soon as I watched it, I thought, wow, these are really good stories. And he had really I just thought kind of profound and really honest reactions to what went on. And he was incredibly honest in the video. So at first I thought, well, I'll just write something about my uncle. And, one person, one videotape, that doesn't make a book or even an article, even though I tried to write an article about him. The other probably major player was a man named Jack Anderson, and he and my uncle were actually friends. And Jack Anderson wrote a book about his experiences called Warrior by Choice, Warrior by Chance, or maybe it was the other way around. And that book has a lot of great stories. And then one of the men who joined the company later, after they were first in Australia, decided he would become the historian for the 41st Division, and he wrote literally hundreds and hundreds of accounts of specific battles and events with names and places, and those were all published in one big book. And then the fourth soldier is the one I know the least about, and who was really involved in the book for the least amount of time, I found through the National Archives. He had just done an interview for the National Archives about World War II, and I was able to access that. I accessed papers at the University of Montana, which is where the soldier who wrote all the stuff's papers were located. His name is Hargis Westerfield. And in there, I found a diary that was written by a Japanese soldier to kind of show the other side of some of the events that my uncle's or Company G was involved in. That Japanese soldier is probably the fifth soldier. In the book, I talk about it, but it's just in kind of one place.
It sounds in many ways like a novel.
Well, I hope that it has that.
I don't mean that it doesn't sound factual, but it sounds like
No.
there's a real personal story here.
The idea that it sounds like a novel makes me happy.
Yeah.
Because I want it to be a popular work of not popular since everybody buys it, but the kind of work of history that casual readers who aren't necessarily even military history readers might pick up and find the human interest stories in it worthwhile. I'm kind of trying to create a hybrid between that kind of story and the military history with all the details and maps at the same time in the book. So saying it sounds like a novel, I kind of think that too. But I'm not a novel.
You're taking that as a compliment. That's good.
Yes, I definitely am.
I got an even more woo-woo question for you now. In what way are you in this book? in the way that you shaped it. I know you have very strong political views about this, that, and the other thing, and I agree with you, I think 99.9% of the time. And I also know that you're a voracious reader of both fiction and non. So, how are you in this book?
That is a long answer. You sure you want the whole thing?
Give it to me.
Cut it where you can. So, when I was a kid, I think like a lot of young little boys who were interested in history, the part of history I was interested in was battles and guns and tanks and cannons and all that kind of stuff. And somehow, in all of my historical writing, that's always been a part of what I write about. My first book was about a Marine in World War I and his experiences there, and then his experiences after World War I back in the United States when he became a writer. This book is a work of military history, but at the same time kind of focuses on, somebody who's close to me. The other part of me I think is in the book is that my uncle, who's featured in the book, was really, really important to my dad and was kind of like a second father to my dad in lots of ways. And so I wanted to write the book for him because he admired his uncle so much. And then from the political point of view, a couple of things I found fascinating is one, in the United States, we don't teach a lot about the war in the Pacific. And I think that's a shame because, the men who went and fought, died, fought, did all the whole thing, just like the men in Europe did. But one of the things I think is more unique about the war in the Pacific is the interaction between the American soldiers and the Japanese soldiers, both of whom were convinced in lots of ways that they were superior, culturally, racially superior to one another, and what that looked like when these two groups came together, because it's much different than the way in which American soldiers interacted with German soldiers or Italian soldiers when they were fighting in Europe. It is a much more ruthless kind of war. And so one of the things that I was interested in is how did my uncle, very religious man, very upstanding member of the community, how did that work for him? How did he how did he do the things that he was required to do in the face of Japanese? And I hope by adding the story from the Japanese soldier that I kind of humanize the Japanese soldiers who are involved in the fighting as well, because in reading the accounts from American soldiers, there's not a lot of humanizing of the Japanese that they were fighting in. So that's kind of I think all those things are kind of me.
They do sound very much like you. Yes. What are you working on now?
My wife and I are writing a mystery novel together.
Seriously.
Yep,
That's amazing.
we have finished the first draft, and we're going to begin editing here soon. As soon as I can get over the politics hangover and realize that life is going to go on, we're going to pick it up and hopefully add about 10,000 words to it through description and stuff like that. The plot's there, the outlines of the characters are there. So yeah, that's been a lot of fun. It's given us something to talk about on car trips and to work on together. And I read a lot and have read a lot of mysteries. And so, I just said, hey, I have an idea for a mystery. Let's just write this together. And so that's
Well,
kind of what we're doing.
so my first reaction is that's absolutely incredible. I love the fact that you're working on a book with your wife. That's wonderful. And second of all, I think there's this grand booktube conspiracy to get me to read a mystery, and I think you are now part of it.
Well, if we ever get it in print in any way, shape, or form, I will send you one with the requirement that you read it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's a deal. I usually have my mystery guests recommend books that they've recently been reading, and I didn't think that that would work particularly well because Brian has a bigger channel than me, has a bigger audience than me, and everybody knows what Brian's has read or who is reading. So instead, I thought I'd ask Brian for recommendations for pairings of fiction with your book. So what have you got for us?
Okay, well, I only have one work of fiction I think pairs my
Oh,
book,
that's
and
fine.
the other two are nonfiction. Let me do the nonfiction ones first. The first nonfiction is one that probably everybody in the United States have heard of, and that would be Band of Brothers by Stephen Ambrose. There was a whole HBO series about it, and it was a really popular book. And I think that kind of relates to my book in the way in which I hope to capture some things about the men's lives who are fighting in Company G, just like I think Ambrose did in that book. So maybe it's completely selfish of me, but I kind of want to associate my book with that book in some ways. The second nonfiction book is a really good book. It sold a lot of copies, but it's one of those books that kind of comes and goes, and it's called The Ghost Mountain Boys by James Campbell. So real quick, my uncle's unit fought first in New Guinea. That's where they went. They went to Australia, and from Australia they fought in New Guinea. but they were a replacement unit for another division that had been fighting in New Guinea before, and that was the 32nd Division. And the 32nd Division are known in the book as the Ghost Mountain Boys because they're the ones who fought the Japanese over the Owen Stanley Mountains through the jungle, suffered terribly, just awful, awful conditions. And the Ghost Mountain Boys is a great book in that regard, which definitely inspired me to kind of look at and write about the Company G's things in a specific way. But the fiction book I would recommend is called Fingerbone by Hiroki Takahashi. It is a novella. It's probably maybe 104, 105 pages. One of the things that I thought was great when I read it was it tells, in some ways, the story of the Japanese in New Guinea, right where my uncle was fighting. It's fictionalized, and Takahashi is not a veteran. This is just a novel he wrote based on a practice that the Japanese had of taking a finger bone from their dead and sending that back to their families because they couldn't evacuate or even bury their dead in New Guinea or other places. They would just remove a finger bone and send that back to their families so they could commemorate their son's death. And the book is really good. I think it's a really good story in and of itself, but it does kind of tell the story of at least some of the fighting in New Guinea that my uncle was on the other side of from a fictional point of view.
Wow, I have not heard of that. That sounds absolutely fascinating. They all do. You were so economical in your descriptions of your book recommendations. I want to share an anecdote with you.
Okay.
It's not really an anecdote, but we're kind of sorting through all the stuff at the family farm, have been this year. And one of the things that got rescued, it was in no danger of being thrown out, but the family had kind of forgotten it
Mm-hmm.
in a corner on a shelf in a basement. And it's the photograph of my grandfather Mooney's World War I regiment. He fought in the Canadian
Right.
Army in World War I, and it's the picture of that regiment. And it's an
Awesome.
absolutely incredible picture. And it used to hang on the wall in my grandparents' house, but it's, been collecting dust for decades
Yeah.
in the basement. And I can't find my grandfather. I used to always be able to find him, and now, so I got a magnifying glass, and I haven't been able to find him yet. But I cannot believe the detail. Like it's a photograph from 1916, maybe 17. So it's well over 100 years old. But the quality of the photograph is such that with a magnifying glass, you just kind of step back into history because you can
Wow.
see the facial expressions. Like looking at it, you can't see anybody's face, but with a magnifying glass, you can go right into their faces, like you get right close up to their faces and see what kind of mood they were in. Like it's like I want to do something with that picture, somehow enlarge the picture or bring the faces out so that they're on a much larger photo because it tells such a story
Yeah. Yeah.
from so far back in history. It just has really
Yeah.
captured my imagination. So
That
that's
that sounds really cool.
an inchoate project of mine to do something with that photograph because it's just fascinating.
Well, I hope
So,
you do.
yeah, and actually we also have his letters back to
Oh,
his parents.
that's
I've
really
had
cool.
those. Yeah, in his diary. His letters to my grandmother, his fiance at the time.
Wow.
She told us when my grandpa died in 1980, she said, "Oh, I cremated those a long time ago, so we don't have those, but we have the ones back to his parents." So maybe
Well,
I'll hire you to write a book about him, about
that sounds
that
like a
regiment.
book.
That does sound like so. Congratulations on the book,
Thank you.
Brian. It sounds really fascinating. Keep fighting the good fight.
I will do my best with my
Thanks so
limited
much.
resources.
All right. Well, that was a wonderful chat, and Brian is a wonderful guy. Thank God the United States of America has him. He's going to be busy over the next 400 years of the Trump era. Okay, so let's kind of move into bookish territory, shall we? I actually did finish a couple books, and I'm going to be starting one. I only got one video posted, but it was a really great discussion video with Melanie, my patron and subscriber. We buddy read Held by Anne Michaels together, and so that chat went up on my channel, and that's all I posted. And I'll say that I've got another book giveaway on Patreon, so if you join at any level, you can enter this book giveaway. It'll be, I'm not sure, at least 2 weeks. It'll be up there for a chance for patrons to enter, and it is this wonderful memoir. I guess memoir is the best word genre for it. The Bookstore That Floated Away by Sarah Henshaw. and I read it years ago, loved it, and most recently mentioned it in my mystery guest chat with Rowan Mason, and she loved it too, so I was pleased about that. I finally finished, and I've had this book overdue from the library for about 2 weeks, so I'm rushing off later today, hopefully, to return it. Spinster Kang by Zoë S. Roy. This was for Spinster September, and what are we at? November 8th, so I've been reading it for a while, as is my wont. And I enjoyed it. I gave it 4 stars, which to me is a far less than perfect book. And the flaws in it prevented me from fully loving it, but there were parts of it that I absolutely loved. The narrative voice is quite naive. This Chinese immigrant woman whose sister was raped when she was a preteen, when our protagonist was a preteen in China, and she swore off men ever since, and she's now been in Canada for a couple of years. Her memories of that trauma, and also just the trauma of being Chinese, what a horrible country that is, in terms of its politics, and the Cultural Revolution and stuff, all of that was just beautifully, vividly described. Little Chinese idioms that she would bring into the book, and I just appreciated all of that so much. Her attempts to make relationships, friendships with people in Toronto where she lived, some of it was almost comic. She rooms with a lesbian, and she had no conception of what lesbianism is. You find out eventually in the novel that she doesn't really get gay men either, and just her gaydar is virtually non-existent, at least in Western culture. So her next roommate is an older Russian emigre. And one of the things that she does in exchange for free rent, aside from housekeeping, is she ends up copy editing or proofreading this woman's memoir about her life in Russia, the Soviet Union. I think it was Moscow, but I've forgotten now, before she came to Canada. And that's where the novel started to lose me, because I didn't feel like I was reading about Russians. I felt like I was reading about white Canadians. Like the author didn't have the skill to paint a picture that felt authentically Russian and put it in the voice of a Russian woman whose second language is English. And so, while I continued to appreciate the protagonist's experiences and memories and all that throughout, the other characters just didn't strike me as being realistically drawn, and so that detracted to the point where it was only a 4-star read. The other thing was, I didn't ever get the sense that, like, really, a woman would hire her to, who's lived in Canada for 2 years and presumably been speaking and learning English for only 2 years. Perhaps that she wouldn't study very much English in China, I don't think, before she came. She would have the linguistic competency to edit a manuscript, and all of there was no broken English, there was no conversations about making herself understood by native English speakers in the book, and that started to feel unrealistic for me by the end. Those problems aside, it was still very much worth my time, and you might enjoy it even more than I did. Let's end this rather despair-laden Friday Reads on an incredibly upbeat note, shall we? I have also, just last night, finished this Canadian novel, Ivy's Tree by Wendy Burton. I've talked about it once or twice already, and I finished it, and I absolutely loved it. Published in 2020 by the Saskatoon publisher Thistledown Press, although Wendy Burton lives on Hornby Island in British Columbia. And this is her debut novel. So, as I've told you, but you may not have seen those videos, the protagonist is a 78-year-old widow from Vancouver whose spoiled, rotten daughter, a character that I just loathed from the first time she appeared on the page, convinces her to sell the house that she and her late husband, had lived in and raised this daughter in, had it for decades and decades, to sell everything and move over to Tokyo to live with her and her Japanese husband and their 2 sons. And she does it. And I started dreading that decision even before she got there, because she shows us only really one scene from a few years prior when this daughter Cynthia had visited with the grandkids, and she was just such a spoiled, selfish adult daughter, that I thought, why? Oh my God, this isn't going to go well. Well, I was right. So it's almost a horror story in terms of her moving there, not speaking a word of Japanese, and a daughter who doesn't really love her. And so the reader is left to wonder, why did she go? Why did the daughter want her to go when they have a completely non-existent emotional relationship? And there's no communication. They don't take her out maybe once in the first 6 weeks. They take her out one time, and she's just there. It's a very unusual premise for a novel, and it worked so powerfully for me. It was one of the most emotionally compelling, beautifully told novels I've read in a long time. I just loved Ivy, and I'm not going to say any more about what she does, but it's not all doom and gloom, let's put it that way. She is still deeply grieving the loss of her husband. I think he'd been dead maybe a year, something like that, maybe 2 years, and goes through a lot of that as she comes to terms with this new, completely neglectful family situation she's living in, and starts to self-actualize in ways that really rang true and were beautiful to read. So you will definitely be hearing more about this book on my channel, and I recommend this very heartfully to you. I read that to Mary Jean, and she also really, really loved it. So I'm not sure if we're going to take a little bit of a break before I start reading the next book to her. Probably not that long of a break, but whatever, however that pans out. We're going to go back to the Emma M. Lyon series, the Unselected Journals of Emma M. Lyon by Beth Brower. We quite enjoyed Volume 1, and we really deeply enjoyed Volume 2. So here is Volume 3, which is double the length of the first two. And that's what I'm going to read to Mary Jean next. That'll keep us busy for quite a while. Thanks for watching.